If you had stepped into the dwelling of a medieval peasant, the first thing to catch your eye would not have been a chair, a bed, or even a chest of tools. It would have been the hearth. The fire was the heart of the home, and at its center, a humble clay pot simmered almost without rest. This pot was more than an object of cooking. It was the very guardian of survival, the vessel into which scraps, roots, and bones were transformed into something resembling sustenance. In a world where famine was never far, the clay pot was the difference between life and death. The pot itself was usually blackened with soot, hanging over the fire on an iron hook or nestled among embers. Its surface bore the scars of endless use, the glaze cracked, the clay hardened by years of flame. Around it, children huddled for warmth, their eyes fixed on the bubbling stew that promised comfort in an otherwise merciless world. To the peasant family, the pot was not merely a tool. It was a symbol of hope, a reminder that as long as something could be thrown inside, life might endure another day. The meal within was never the same twice. Into the pot went whatever the household could spare: cabbage leaves, turnip tops, stale bread, beans if fortune allowed, and always water to stretch the mixture further. Sometimes the pot carried only the ghost of flavor, the water tinted by bones already boiled dry of marrow. Other times, on feast days or after a good harvest, a scrap of salted pork or a rind of cheese might grace the stew, elevating it from thin gruel to something that actually satisfied hunger. But no matter how thin or thick, the pot was always there, simmering, filling the hut with a fragrance that was often more promise than fulfillment. Cooking in this way had its own rhythm, one tied to the pulse of peasant life. The pot rarely cooled. When one meal was taken, more water and scraps were added, creating a perpetual stew that could last for days or weeks. Families joked, sometimes grimly, that their stew was older than their children, each generation of flavors blending into the next. In truth, it was a practical strategy. Fuel was precious, and a fire kept burning was more efficient than starting anew each day. The pot, therefore, became a living archive of meals past, its taste deepened by time. This perpetual stew was not just food, it was a ritual. Mothers stirred it while humming lullabies, fathers added a turnip from the field, children tossed in handfuls of wild greens. It gathered the family together, not only in hunger, but in shared creation. Every villager understood the sight and sound of a bubbling pot. It was the heartbeat of survival, a comfort that echoed across Europe from huts in England to cottages in Poland. Yet, the pot also reflected the harshness of peasant life. To peer into it was to see poverty laid bare, a broth stretched so thin it barely colored the water, vegetables boiled to mush, a meal that filled the stomach but rarely the spirit. Hunger was never fully banished, only delayed. And still the clay pot offered something precious: warmth, flavor, and the illusion, however fragile, of fullness. The fire that sustained the pot was a fickle ally. In winter, smoke stung the eyes and filled the hut, clinging to clothes and walls. In summer, the heat was oppressive, suffocating the family within. Yet no one questioned the need for it. The fire gave life, and the pot upon it gave strength. Together they formed the sacred center of the medieval peasant household, an altar of survival where hunger and hope wrestled endlessly. So it was that the fire and the clay pot shaped the rhythm of daily existence. To lose the pot was disaster. To let the fire die, catastrophe. In the fragile world of medieval poverty, these two were constants, guardians against the storm of famine that threatened at every turn. The pot might have been humble, cracked, and patched with care, but within its bubbling depths lived the spirit of survival, simmering always, never giving in to despair. If the clay pot was the heart of the peasant household, then its contents revealed the realities of survival. The ingredients of a poor man's stew were not chosen for flavor or luxury, but for necessity. They were scraps, remnants, and the forgotten parts of the harvest. Ingredients that nobles would scoff at, but which for peasants meant the chance to endure another day. Foremost among these were root vegetables, turnips, parsnips, carrots, and above all, the hardy cabbage. These crops grew in poor soil, survived cold weather, and could be stored through winter. A medieval peasant might slice a turnip so thin it barely flavored the broth, yet it was enough to convince the children that they were eating a meal. Cabbage, boiled endlessly, softened into thick strands that gave bulk to the pot, filling empty stomachs, even if nutrition was meager. Such ingredients were not glamorous, but they were faithful companions in the eternal fight against hunger. Beans and peas were treasures when they could be had. Dried in summer, they could be stored in sacks through the lean months and revived in boiling water. They thickened the broth, offered protein, and gave a sense of substance absent from thin vegetable water. But beans were not always guaranteed. Harvests failed, markets were distant, and famine could strip entire villages of legumes. When beans were missing, bread often stepped in. Not fresh bread, for that was a rarity, but stale crusts and hardened heels that no one could chew. Crumbled into the pot, they softened into a thick paste, lending body to the stew and transforming waste into sustenance. Animal products, when they appeared, were almost always scraps. A bone, stripped nearly bare of meat, still held flavor and marrow, and it was precious. A pig's trotter, a chicken's neck, or the skin of a rabbit might find its way into the pot, their richness seeping slowly into the water. Fat was a rare luxury. A dollop of lard or a sliver of bacon rind could turn a thin broth into something unforgettable, its scent filling the hut like a promise of nobility's feasts. Peasants often joked that they boiled the memory of meat into their stew, for the taste was faint but enough to remind them of what they could not afford. Even cheese rinds found their place. A hardened lump of old cheese, impossible to bite, softened into the stew and gave it salt and sharpness. Nothing was wasted. The peasant's stew was not about richness, but about stretching the smallest scrap into the farthest reach. It was food alchemy, transforming what seemed inedible into the essence of survival. Sometimes, the stew carried flavors from the fields themselves. Onions, leeks, and garlic, easy to grow, resistant to weather, were treasured. They gave strength, heat, and a depth of taste that peasants swore kept illness at bay. When a household had a clove of garlic to spare, it was treated almost as medicine, its pungent aroma filling both pot and lungs with vitality. Without such seasoning, many a pot would have been nothing but bland water and limp leaves. The rhythm of these humble ingredients told the story of the seasons. In autumn, there might be turnips and beans, hearty and filling. In winter, only cabbage and roots pulled from frozen ground. In spring, wild herbs and nettles replaced dwindling stores, bringing bitterness to the pot, but also freshness after months of monotony. By summer, gardens restored some variety, peas, onions, and greens, but always the cycle turned back to scarcity. The stew, then, was a mirror of the year, reflecting both feast and famine. For the medieval poor, the art of survival lay in knowing what to throw into the pot, and when. It was not cuisine in the modern sense, but an act of endurance. Every peel, every crust, every bone mattered. To a peasant family, there was no such thing as waste. All found its way into the bubbling clay pot, where hunger was fought one humble ingredient at a time. When the fields yielded little and the stores ran thin, peasants turned to the wild. The countryside was not only their workplace but their pantry and their apothecary. Knowledge of herbs, passed from grandmother to granddaughter, from old shepherd to young boy, became the difference between going hungry and finding enough to keep the pot alive. The poor became foragers, masters of transforming what others called weeds into sustenance. Nettles were among the most common additions to the peasant's pot. Though their sting was dreaded by bare hands, once boiled, they lost their venom and softened into a rich, dark green broth. Nettles carried nutrients the peasants scarcely understood, but their bodies knew: iron, strength, and warmth. For many, a nettle stew in spring was the first fresh taste after the bleak winter months. It was said that nettles chased the cold out of the bones, a phrase mothers repeated as they served it to their children. Dandelion leaves, bitter but nourishing, often joined nettles in the bubbling mixture. Peasants plucked them from fields and meadows, knowing that bitterness itself was a kind of strength. Sorrel, with its sharp lemon tang, added freshness to a stew otherwise heavy with roots and stale bread. These wild greens were not luxuries. They were survival food, gathered quickly before other mouths or animals claimed them first. Garlic mustard, chickweed, and lamb's quarters found their way into many pots as well. These plants, dismissed by nobles as weeds, were treasures to the poor. They provided flavor, vitamins, and sometimes even healing. To a medieval villager, there was little division between food and medicine. A stew thickened with herbs was not only filling, it was a shield against illness. The countryside also offered mushrooms, though these were harvested with care and superstition. Stories abounded of poisonous fungi that could kill a man within hours. But the wise knew which ones were safe. Mushrooms brought a meaty taste to a stew, otherwise devoid of flesh, their earthy aroma tricking the senses into believing the pot held more than it truly did. Some villagers swore by drying mushrooms for winter use, hanging them in bundles from the rafters, ready to drop into the boiling clay vessel when supplies ran low. Beyond flavor, many of these herbs were thought to have protective powers. Sage was considered sacred, a plant of healing and preservation. Thyme, when it could be found or grown, was thought to chase away melancholy and strengthen the body against plague. Even when used sparingly, herbs turned the humble pot into something more than food, a charm, a remedy, a whisper of hope in a dangerous world. Children were often sent to gather herbs, their small hands clutching baskets filled with nettles, sorrel, or wild onions. For them, the search was both a chore and a lesson in survival. Each plant learned was a future meal saved. Villagers relied on this folk knowledge more than on written recipes, for few among the poor could read. The forest and meadow were their cookbooks, each season teaching its own chapter. It is easy, centuries later, to dismiss these peasant stews as little more than weeds in water. Yet within their simplicity lay ingenuity. Each herb brought not only sustenance, but meaning. To the villagers, the nettle was resilience, the sorrel was renewal, the mushroom was fortune found in the shadow of trees. Their stew was more than a dish. It was an encyclopedia of the countryside, a living record of human adaptation to nature's generosity and cruelty. The wild herbs made the difference between despair and endurance. They did not transform the pot into a feast, but they kept life moving forward. In every stingless nettle, every bitter dandelion leaf, the poor found proof of their unyielding resourcefulness. When the land gave nothing else, it gave weeds, and from weeds, the peasants crafted survival. If there was one thing that defined the flavor of the poor man's stew, it was not richness, but restraint. Spices and seasonings in the Middle Ages were luxuries, often worth their weight in silver. Nobles sprinkled cinnamon, saffron, and pepper into elaborate dishes, but for peasants, these treasures might as well have belonged to another world. Yet even in poverty, flavor mattered. The poor found their own spices, humble but powerful, that transformed thin broths into meals that carried comfort as well as sustenance. Salt stood above all. It was not simply a seasoning but a necessity for life. To the poor, salt was precious, rationed carefully, and bought at painful cost from markets controlled by lords or kings. A pinch of salt in a pot of cabbage soup could mean the difference between unbearable blandness and something the family could eat with gratitude. But salt was also political. Monopolies, taxes, and wars often placed it beyond the reach of peasants. In lean times, families endured pots of unsalted broth, reminding them that even the simplest pleasures were bound to wealth and power. Garlic and onions became the true champions of the peasant's table. Hardy, cheap, and easy to grow, they were both food and spice. A single clove of garlic crushed into a pot could lift the entire stew, its pungent strength seeping into every mouthful. Onions, boiled until sweet, brought depth and body where none existed before. They were peasant luxuries, affordable to most, and celebrated in songs and jokes that praised their power to turn water into broth. To this day, the memory of medieval poverty clings to garlic and onion, for they were the flavor of survival. Leeks and chives, gathered from gardens or meadows, often substituted for expensive herbs. Their green sharpness offered brightness to otherwise dull mixtures, and villagers believed they strengthened the blood. In Welsh tradition, leeks became symbols of resilience, worn even in battle. In the stew, they were symbols of endurance, lending dignity to a meal of scraps. Animal fat, when available, was a seasoning in itself. A dollop of lard, a strip of bacon rind, or even the grease scraped from a pan turned thin broth into something deeply satisfying. The aroma alone could fill the hut with a sense of feast, though the actual amount was pitiful. Some families even saved fat in small pots, eking it out across weeks, knowing that just a trace could transform a pot of watery turnips into something rich enough to trick the body into satiety. Occasionally, luck brought rarities. A merchant might sell a handful of peppercorns, a noble might gift leftover spices to a favored servant, or a church feast might leave behind crumbs of saffron rice. These moments were extraordinary, remembered for years, the taste of pepper or saffron becoming legends told around firesides. Children who licked the rim of a spice-stained bowl spoke of it long after, as if they had glimpsed paradise. But these were exceptions, rare and fleeting, soon replaced by the familiar bitterness of sorrel and the sharpness of garlic. Spices, then, were a mirror of inequality. For nobles, they were abundance, a display of wealth and power. For peasants, they were longing, the faint dream of flavors that belonged to another world. And yet, within their poverty, the peasants found their own artistry. They built flavor from what they had: garlic, onion, leeks, salt, and fat, seasonings born not of empire, but of earth. To them, these were not poor man's spices, but the true saviors of the pot. In every bubbling clay vessel, the spices of poverty gave more than taste. They gave morale, dignity, and the illusion of plenty. For a family with little, that illusion mattered as much as the food itself. There was a cruel time in the medieval year that peasants feared more than winter itself: the hungry months. This was the stretch between the end of winter and the first harvest of spring, when food stores dwindled and fields had not yet yielded new crops. In these months, survival was not about eating well. It was about eating at all. Recipes were born not from choice, but from desperation, and the poor became masters of stretching the last scraps into meals that kept families alive. One of the most common survival stews was made from stale bread boiled into broth. Bread was life to the medieval peasant, and when it hardened to stone, it was not wasted. Chunks were softened in boiling water, flavored with onions or leeks if they could be spared. Sometimes milk or ale was poured in to enrich it, but often it was little more than soggy bread ladled into wooden bowls. Children grew up knowing this bread soup as both comfort and curse, the dish that filled their bellies but reminded them of want. Pottage, the universal stew of medieval Europe, became the vessel of survival. Into it went whatever could be found: barley, oats, beans, or dried peas if they had been stored well. More often, wild herbs and roots filled the pot, with a pinch of salt or garlic to disguise the monotony. The stew was kept simmering day after day, new scraps added as they appeared, the flavor deepening like the memory of struggle. It was never truly finished. It was the eternal meal, a reflection of peasant endurance. Turnips and parsnips became saviors in this season. Hardy, long-lasting, and easy to grow, they could be roasted in the fire or sliced into stews. Their sweetness offered relief from the bitterness of weeds. Families with a few turnips left in storage guarded them like treasure, for they could stretch across many meals. In folk sayings, turnips were called the peasant's friend, for they endured where finer foods failed. Oats, too, were a backbone of survival. When wheat was gone and barley scarce, oat gruel filled the void. It was plain, but nourishing enough to keep laborers on their feet. In some places, peasants mixed oats with water and boiled them until thick, adding herbs for flavor. The Scottish brose and English gruel both have roots in these desperate times. Gruel became a symbol of poverty, yet it was the food that carried countless families through famine and plague. When even these staples were scarce, peasants turned to chestnuts, acorns, and beans, foods that required labor to make edible. Acorns, soaked to remove their bitterness, were ground into flour or tossed into stews. Chestnuts were boiled or roasted, a sweet relief compared to roots and weeds. Dried beans, if preserved well, could last through the hungry months, swelling into hearty meals when softened in boiling water. Such foods were slow, stubborn gifts from nature, requiring patience to prepare but rewarding it with survival. Meat was almost never part of these recipes. A bone, however, could transform a pot. Even when stripped of flesh, a bone boiled for hours released fat and marrow, turning thin soup into something resembling nourishment. Villagers would pass bones from family to family, reboiling them until nothing remained. It was said that by the fifth boiling, there was no taste left, only the ghost of meat, a fitting metaphor for the ghost of plenty haunting the poor. These survival recipes were not delicacies, they were strategies. Each one reflected ingenuity, the ability to stretch, adapt, and endure. They were not written in books, but carved into memory, passed from mouth to mouth, from mother to daughter, as the only inheritance many peasants could give. In the hungry months, the true art of cooking was not in taste, but in endurance. Every stale crust, every bitter weed, every simmering pot was proof of humanity's refusal to yield to hunger. In the heart of the medieval village, food was never simply an individual affair. Survival was a collective endeavor, and nowhere was this clearer than in the cooking fires of the poor. The image of a single family huddled around its hearth was true enough, but alongside it ran another story, one of communal pots, shared meals, and the bonds of necessity forged through hunger. For peasants, whose individual resources were meager, pooling food often meant the difference between starvation and endurance. A family with turnips but no grain might trade with neighbors who had oats but no roots. The village stew became a patchwork of contributions, each household adding what it could. In these shared meals, hunger was spread thinner and survival more certain. The pot itself became a symbol of solidarity, a vessel not only of food, but of community. Feasts were not reserved for lords alone. Even in poverty, peasants marked holy days, harvest festivals, and weddings with communal cooking. A great cauldron was set above the fire, into which villagers poured barley, beans, vegetables, and, if fortune smiled, the rare scraps of meat. Such occasions were precious, not only for the abundance of food, but for the reminder that life was more than toil and hunger. To eat together was to affirm belonging, to find strength in fellowship as much as in nourishment. The church, too, played its part. Monasteries were bound by Christian duty to feed the poor, and though their charity was often meager, it could be life-saving. On certain feast days, villagers lined up with wooden bowls in hand, waiting for ladles of pottage or bread soaked in broth. The food was plain, sometimes little better than their own, but the act of giving carried spiritual weight. To receive from the church's pot was to be reminded that poverty was not shameful, but shared, sanctified by faith. There were darker sides to communal cooking as well. In times of famine, quarrels broke out over contributions and portions. Some accused neighbors of withholding food, of adding too little to the pot but taking too much from it. Suspicion could corrode the fragile trust that kept villages alive. Yet even in these moments, the pot remained at the center of survival. A contested, sacred object, both lifeline and battleground. Communal pots also reflected the rhythms of labor. During harvest or building projects, villagers often cooked and ate together, each man and woman laboring through the day and returning to a shared fire. A stew brewed at the edge of the fields sustained entire work crews, the bubbling pot binding them together as firmly as the tools in their hands. Eating from the same bowl or drinking from the same ladle was more than convenience. It was a ritual of unity. Children grew up with these shared meals, learning early that food was not merely theirs, but part of the village's lifeblood. They carried baskets of greens or bundles of sticks for the communal fire, watching as their mothers stirred the pot and their fathers divided the portions. For them, the taste of shared stew was the taste of childhood itself, warmth, chatter, and the faint illusion of plenty in a world of scarcity. It is tempting to imagine medieval peasants as isolated families clinging to survival, but the truth is richer. Their strength lay in community, in the shared labor of fields and fires, in the communal pot that boiled with contributions and carried with it not only food, but hope. In every ladleful was a reminder that even the poorest could endure, not alone, but together. Hunger is not only a matter of the body, it gnaws at the mind, weakening spirit as much as flesh. For the medieval poor, the humble stew was more than sustenance. It was reassurance, memory, and hope simmering in a pot. It gave the illusion of plenty, the comfort of warmth, and the promise that tomorrow, too, there would be something to eat. The sight alone of a bubbling pot soothed weary hearts. A family returning from the fields, hands calloused and backs bent, would see steam curling from the hearth and know that something awaited them, however thin, however bitter. The stew carried the assurance of continuity. It meant they had survived one more day. In a world where famine and disease hovered constantly, this simple promise mattered deeply. Smell was another source of comfort. Even the aroma of boiling onions or garlic could fill a hut with a sense of abundance. The fragrance traveled before the food itself, lifting spirits, rousing appetites, and turning a shack into a home. In the long silence of winter nights, the smell of stew was company, a reminder that life persisted within the walls while darkness pressed from without. Stew also carried memory. The ingredients of each pot reflected the season and the land, linking families to their ancestors who had cooked the same nettles, beans, or turnips centuries before. Recipes were not written, but remembered in taste and smell, passed from mother to child like lullabies. Eating the same stew year after year connected peasants to their lineage, to their village, and to the rhythms of the earth itself. In times of hardship, stew served as a psychological anchor. A starving family could not dream of feasts or plenty, but they could dream of stew. Thicker tomorrow, richer the next week, perhaps graced with a bone or a scrap of meat if fortune shifted. The pot symbolized possibility, something always in the making, something that could improve if only time or chance allowed. Unlike bread, which disappeared quickly, stew was perpetual. It stayed on the fire, absorbing whatever came, always there to return to. Children, especially, found comfort in stew. They might not understand scarcity, but they felt the safety of routine. The familiar bowl placed before them, the warmth against their palms, the soft texture that filled their bellies. For them, stew was security, the edible proof that parents provided, that life continued. Many a medieval lullaby was sung beside a steaming pot, the two comforts, song and stew, woven into the memory of survival. The act of sharing stew deepened its psychological role. To eat from the same pot, to dip bread into the same broth, was to affirm unity. Quarrels might divide neighbors, hunger might sharpen tempers, but the communal pot reminded everyone that survival was shared. It symbolized a fragile but vital solidarity, the knowledge that no one endured hunger alone. Even in its thinness, stew carried dignity. To ladle stew into bowls was to serve a meal, however poor. It gave structure to the day, civility to the act of eating, and ritual to the rhythms of life. In this way, stew became not merely food, but a shield against despair. It turned scarcity into continuity, want into endurance, and hunger into patience. Thus, the poor man's stew was not simply a culinary invention, but a psychological necessity. It fed not only the stomach but the soul, offering warmth where the world was cold, routine where life was uncertain, and hope where despair threatened. In every bowl, the peasants consumed not just nettles, oats, or turnips, but resilience itself. No story of the medieval poor man's stew can be complete without acknowledging the shadows that fell over it during famine. There were years when even the eternal pot went cold, when no weeds could be gathered, no grain could be begged, no roots left in the cellar. In such times, desperation reshaped the meaning of food, and the line between survival and despair blurred dangerously. Famine was not rare. Bad harvests, war, plague, or the taxes of greedy lords could empty granaries and leave villages hollow. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 swept across Europe, and in those years peasants spoke of eating things that were never meant for human mouths. Dogs, cats, rats, anything that could be caught found its way into the pot. Chroniclers tell of villagers boiling grass and bark, turning them into blackened paste that filled the stomach but gave no strength. Such accounts are not exaggerations. but desperate echoes of human endurance at its lowest point. In these times, the communal pot became a grim mirror of suffering. Instead of abundance, it reflected absence. Families came with nothing to contribute, empty-handed and hollow-eyed. The pot bubbled with little more than water, flavored by whatever scraps could be scavenged. A single onion was split among dozens. A bone passed from fire to fire until nothing remained. Yet even in this misery, the pot was kept alive. It was the last flicker of defiance against hunger's silence. The psychological comfort of stew faltered under famine. Instead of reassuring, its thinness mocked the starving. Children cried over bowls that were more water than food. Mothers wept as they stirred broth that could not satisfy. Hunger drove people to barter away heirlooms, tools, even their own labor for the promise of a ladle of pottage. It was in these moments that the poor realized how deeply food was tied to power, and how easily survival could be taken from them. There were stories of darker deeds, whispered but remembered. Some chronicles claimed that in the worst years, famine led to cannibalism, parents driven to madness by the cries of starving children. Whether true or amplified by horrified monks, these tales reveal how close humanity drifted to the edge when stew failed to sustain life. Hunger stripped away dignity, morality, even humanity itself, leaving only raw survival. And yet, within this darkness, there were sparks of resilience. Villagers learned to grind acorns, chestnuts, even weeds into flour, baking bitter loaves that staved off death. They boiled animal hides, softening leather into chewable strips. These meals were grotesque, but they were proof of the will to live. Famine turned every scrap into treasure, every weed into possibility. Even as the stew grew weaker, the human spirit sought ways to keep it alive. The church preached that famine was divine punishment, a scourge for sin. But for the poor, this explanation was hollow. They knew the earth's cruelty too well, and they saw with bitter eyes how lords still feasted while their children starved. Famine was not just hunger, it was injustice, and the stew pot, emptied and desperate, became a symbol of inequality as much as endurance. When the famine passed, when harvests returned and pots grew thicker once more, the memory of hunger lingered. Survivors spoke of those terrible stews, of the weeds boiled into bitterness, of the bones sucked dry of marrow. These stories became warnings, passed to children so they would never forget that the pot could fail, that hunger could return. In the medieval imagination, famine haunted every meal, a shadow that turned even abundance into fragile fortune. Thus, the poor man's stew, so often a symbol of resilience, was also a reminder of vulnerability. It could comfort, it could sustain, but it could also betray, leaving only water, weeds, and despair. The pot was life, but in famine, it became a cruel reminder of how close death always lingered. The poor man's stew was never just food. In medieval imagination, the pot itself became wrapped in legend and folklore, a humble cauldron that carried symbolic weight far beyond its clay or iron walls. To the peasant, it was survival made tangible, a daily miracle wrought not by saints or kings, but by their own endurance. As a result, stories, songs, and sayings grew around the peasant's pot, transforming it into both a practical vessel and a cultural icon. In many villages, the pot was believed to hold luck. To let it go cold was not only wasteful but unlucky, as if extinguishing the fire threatened the family's survival. Tales were told of families cursed when they failed to keep their pot alive, spirits abandoning the hearth in anger. The stew became a kind of living thing, a constant presence, its bubbling voice echoing in the silence of winter nights. To stir it was to stir life itself. Folklore often cast the pot as a magical object. Fairy tales spoke of enchanted cauldrons that never emptied, feeding whole villages forever. These were the dreams of hungry peasants, spun into stories told to children by firelight. The fantasy of an endless stew pot, always full, was the opposite of their reality. But by telling it, they preserved hope, a reminder that in heaven, or perhaps in some faraway land, hunger did not exist. Sayings rooted in the pot also filled peasant speech. In England, the proverb, "The pot always boils for him who stirs it," warned that effort must be constant to earn reward. In France, peasants spoke of the poor man's spice when adding garlic or onion to their broth, a phrase that carried both humor and pride. These words reflected not despair, but resilience, a recognition that even the poorest could create meaning and flavor with what they had. The pot also appeared in religious symbolism. Some preachers likened the communal stew to the body of Christ, many parts becoming one. Just as barley, beans, and herbs lost their individuality in the boiling broth, so too did Christians become one in faith. While this metaphor was more common in sermons than in peasant minds, it reflected the cultural weight that food, and especially the shared pot, carried in medieval life. Legends of famine, too, left their mark. Villagers told of mothers who tricked their children by keeping stones in the pot, stirring them as if they were food, so the little ones would believe a meal was coming. This stone soup story, told across Europe, became a parable of trickery, but also of faith. Sometimes neighbors, moved by pity, would add a scrap of food, and the pot truly became full. In these tales, the stew was not only survival, but a symbol of generosity, the miracle born when hunger forced people to share. For children, the pot was mystery and magic. They peered into its depths, watching scraps transform into steaming broth, as if alchemy itself were taking place. Many fairy stories began with a pot on the fire, grounding wonder in the most ordinary sight of village life. The bubbling stew was the soundtrack of childhood, its rhythm a kind of lullaby, its warmth a promise that life continued. Even centuries later, folklore remembered the poor man's pot with a mixture of reverence and sorrow. It embodied resilience, community, and the eternal struggle between scarcity and survival. To peasants, the stew was never only a dish, it was a story, told anew each evening when the pot was stirred and bowls were filled. In its depths, they saw not only nettles and turnips, but the reflection of their endurance, their faith, and their hope for a world where no pot would ever run dry. Though centuries have passed since peasants huddled around smoky hearths, the memory of the poor man's stew has not vanished. Its ingredients were humble, its flavor plain, yet its legacy stretches far beyond the clay pots and wooden bowls of the medieval poor. Today, it lingers in cuisine, in culture, and in the very idea of resilience that defines human survival. In many ways, the peasant stew was the ancestor of modern comfort food. Soups, broths, porridges, and casseroles all bear traces of it, rooted in the same idea. Gather what you have, simmer it slowly, and let time and fire turn scraps into sustenance. From the French pot-au-feu to the Irish caudle, from Italian minestrone to Eastern European borscht, echoes of the medieval pot can be tasted across continents. What was once necessity has become tradition, celebrated not as desperation, but as heritage. The stew's endurance is also a testament to memory. Families passed down not just recipes, but the idea that survival itself could be an art. To cook with little, To transform weeds and roots into nourishment was not shame, but skill. In modern kitchens, where abundance is taken for granted, chefs often look back to these rustic traditions, rediscovering flavors born of thrift and ingenuity. What the poor once endured, we now savor as authenticity. But the legacy is more than culinary. It is cultural. The stew embodied the medieval poor's relationship with the land, with community, and with hope. It was the bridge between famine and feast, between solitude and solidarity. In every culture, there remains a symbolic pot, whether literal or metaphorical, that represents the gathering of people, the sharing of labor, the resilience of the many against the weight of hunger. The poor man's stew also remains a reminder of inequality. While peasants survived on nettles and turnips, lords feasted on venison, spices, and fine bread. The same Europe that celebrated abundance at banquets forced its poor to scrape weeds into boiling water. To study the stew is to study injustice, to see how hunger is not only about soil and harvest, but about power and privilege. Its legacy warns us that the distance between feast and famine has always been narrow, and often decided not by fortune, but by who controls the food. Yet, there is beauty in this legacy as well. The stew was proof that dignity could survive poverty. Even with nothing, peasants made something. Even when famine struck, they kept the pot alive, stirring hope into every bitter broth. The stew symbolizes the most human of all traits: endurance. It is the story of ordinary people who refused to surrender to despair, who turned the meager offerings of earth into the fuel of survival. In the stories of medieval villages, the pot was more than an object. It was memory, ritual, identity. Today, we can still hear its echoes when families gather around a shared meal, when soup kitchens feed the hungry, when communities cook together in times of crisis. The poor man's stew lives on wherever food is stretched, shared, and honored as more than sustenance, but as solidarity. Thus, the legacy of the poor man's stew is not only medieval, it is eternal. It teaches us that even in the bleakest times, humanity finds a way to preserve hope. In every bubbling pot, whether in a 13th century hut or a 21st century kitchen, lies the same truth: that survival is not measured by luxury, but by resilience, and that even the humblest stew carries within it the strength of generations.